Hello and welcome to the Musical Instrument Investigator. Today we're on the website of Amati Auctions based in the UK, and we're going to have a look at one of their latest auctions, which is bowed stringed musical instruments. More specifically, instruments from the violin family, so violins, violas, cellos, bows and associated bits. This is one of their affordable auctions because they do have kind of lower tier auctions and then specialist stuff with high value. So this is similar to Teresio T2. This has speculative stuff of a lower value, or things which might need some kind of restoration or repair. Actually quite a big auction this time. It's about 253 lots, so quite a large amount, but definitely I think there'll be some interesting things here. Buyer's premium is 22%, so whatever the final hammer price is, you need to add 22% to that. Might be some other fees, VAT, etc. to that. Just to say, this is a UK based auction, so bear that in mind. If you are looking to bid from outside of the UK, then there might be additional charges, import, export, CITES restrictions, all of that usual fun stuff, but you can find all the terms, etc, etc. This auction is finishing on the 1st of May. It's the 24th of April today, so a few days left to go. I'll put a link in the description as always, so check it out yourself. So before we get on to just having a quick look at this auction, just like to say, if you do enjoy these videos, please consider subscribing, like, comment, turn on notifications, all of that fun stuff. So for those of you that are new to looking at the Amati auctions website, just say there's a few things to bear in mind. That they have this 360 viewer, so you can actually have a look all the way around the instrument, the body in any case, which can be quite useful. I've zoomed out here just to make it easier for me to see the extent of the instrument, but in reality the normal page settings are a lot more zoomed in, so you'll see it a bit more clearly, but for ease of me clicking on things, I have it zoomed out a bit. You can also see the measurements here if you click on that, and usually for these, at least the affordable auctions, there's a front view, back view, scroll view, and then a condition report which kind of gives you some information there, so that is quite useful. So like I said, a lot of speculative stuff in this auction. Cello unlabeled, not really kind of getting anything of particular note from that. Condition is not too bad, has some bids already, so we can just move on from this one. Got here a cello inscribed with multiple repairers' names. Okay, so it's got 1834, 1894, 1969, current bid 190. Looks like it might be set up in some kind of classical setup with gut strings. Interesting kind of varnished flames or paint or something. I'm not sure what's really going on there, to be quite honest. Looks a little bit weird, but an interesting looking cello. But wow, that's in some interesting condition here. Green is I think, yeah, new wood, open cracks here, lots of worm on the back. I mean, it does look like it's fairly old. Maybe not anything super crazy. Inked purfling here, so it doesn't have any kind of actual wood purfling there. Hard to say exactly where it's from, but a lot of places, the English were doing kind of inked purfling quite a lot, the Germans, the French to a degree as well. So yeah, interesting. Not sure that this scroll looks a bit newer than the rest of the instrument, but anyway, one to look at and curious enough. Another cello here. This one I quite like as well, actually. 60 the current bid. This one also seems to be not super dissimilar to the other one. Not quite sure if this one has got inked purfling or not. Need to zoom in a bit further on that, but with this current setting, it's not quite so easy. On the back, it looks like there probably is. I think interesting. That's a really strange button on that, so it's a bit odd. Looks like this scroll has had maybe some other type of tuners, like mechanical tuners fitted, I would think, at some point. Not uncommon to see that. A big open crack here, but overall not too bad. Looks like it says traces of worm. I suspect that's actually where there's been plate tuners fitted rather than worm. But yeah, another kind of interesting looking instrument. Might be worth going on the 360 here. Probably spending a bit too much time on these cellos already, to be honest, so it might be a long video, but there we go. Cello unlabeled. This almost certainly current bid 450 just looks like a modern either Romanian or Chinese cello, I would think. I can't really imagine anything else. Got some minor issues, but fairly standard. Cello labelled Andres Zella, Romania. So this is your standard Romanian cello. I think I'm sure it'll be fine for a student, but not particularly inspiring. Half-size cello unlabelled. Once again, it's nothing super crazy. There can be some really nice fractional instruments in these sales, but not so curious. Cello unlabelled here. Once again, not really getting too much from that. 3/4 size cello labelled Karl Hofner. So fairly standard kind of thing there. Once again, a student instrument there. Seeing further labelled Beecher Acoustics, Specialist Luthier in Performance, Supply of Musical Instruments and Accessories. Okay. Cello labelled the Messina, so Stentor. So this is a Chinese cello. You can kind of tell from the varnish. It's a bit over the top, but once again, probably okay for a student. Half-size cello labelled Hidesine Vivente. Once again, I'm pretty sure that that is a kind of Chinese cello. Cello unlabelled. This also looks like a Chinese instrument. Needs a bit of work doing to it, but probably could be okay. This cello, labelled Henri Delisle. This almost, I would assume, is also a Chinese cello, but like I could be wrong. Looks in fairly good condition though. Yep, a cello in good condition. So cello unlabelled. Looks fairly generic. I would probably assume Romanian or something like that, but once again, very difficult to tell sometimes. Nickel mounted cello bow, branded AR Reichel. We'll only look if the bows, if they're super interesting, but nickel mounted cello bow branded Joseph Richter, silver mounted cello bow unbranded. Let's have a quick look at this. Nothing too crazy there. Silver mounted cello bow unbranded. It all looks fairly modern. Nickel mounted cello bow branded Ari France. Okay, 20 bid on that one so far. Here's one of these Coda kind of whatever they are, carbon bows, 70 on that. I think these are actually quite expensive, these ones. So interesting that. Nickel mounted cello bow unbranded, looks fairly standard. Silver mounted viola bow we're on here. Once again, this not very inspiring. Nickel mounted viola bow unbranded. Okay. Nickel mounted viola bow branded El Morazon. This is slightly more interesting looking. Let's have a quick look at the head there. So I think that is, yeah, interesting. Nickel mounted viola bow unbranded. Looks like a bit of a random mixture of things. Nickel mounted viola bow branded Taut. Okay. Nothing too mad. Silver mounted viola bow branded Penzel. Okay, pins there on the thing. Okay. Silver mounted viola bow branded J.E. Vickers. Okay, he was a maker of instruments and bows. Nickel mounted violin viola bow unbranded. Okay. Let's see. Silver mounted violin viola bow unbranded. Okay, needs definitely some work on that. It's an interesting grain here at the head. Worth looking at condition reports on bows as well. So some wear, but nothing too crazy. Silver mounted violin bow unbranded. This is going to be a long auction, I think. Silver mounted violin bow, branded W. Hill and Sons. Okay. Looks kind of fairly interesting. 30 bid on it so far. Stamp looks a little bit funky. Nickel mounted violin bow, unbranded. Interesting adjuster there. Silver mounted violin bow, branded Viola. That's fairly interesting looking. 30 bid on that. Let's see what the wear on head audience side. Okay, there's a few bits to note on that. Silver mounted violin bow, branded P. Boucher, Paris. Okay. Silver mounted violin bow, branded Tubbs. 20 bid on that. Ivory mounted violin bow, unbranded. Yeah, that's really interesting. One of the kind of Kramer types of head. That's quite an interesting bow, actually. Quite like that. What's the condition report on that? Close crack on mount, lift to stick. Okay, new wood on the head. Okay, it looks, is that a pin or something? Yeah, that's interesting. Silver mounted violin bow, unbranded. Need some TLC on that. Nickel mounted violin bow, branded Dodd. Looks Dodd made in Germany, yeah, just a fairly generic bow there. Silver mounted violin bow, unbranded. Okay. Silver mounted violin bow, branded W. Hill and Sons. Okay. This is a real curious one with this plate, like, must be a massive head break, and God knows what's actually going on with this. But I think that is a genuine Hill bow, though, looking at the stamp, one of the lower level ones, so could be an interesting project for someone. Silver mounted violin bow, branded Caressa. 10 on that. Not so many bids on this auction so far. Nickel mounted violin bow, branded Penzel. Silver mounted violin bow, unbranded. Just doesn't look too exciting. Ivory mounted violin bow, unbranded. These kind of I find a lot more interesting. That is fairly crude head, but it's got character. Gold mounted violin bow, branded F. Winkler. Silver mounted violin bow, unbranded. This looks like a pretty modern kind of Chinese bow, maybe for one of the German companies or something like that. Silver mounted violin bow, branded Pilot à Paris. Interesting mounting there. Looks like it's had a big head break. Let's see what the condition report says. Yeah, it's had a bit of a nasty break. Could be an okay bow, but it's had some interesting life. Baroque violin bow. Pretty sure this is just a straight up Chinese bow. Silver mounted violin bow, branded Orchestra. I can ignore that for now. Silver mounted violin bow, unbranded. Quite a lot of bows. A few interesting ones. Silver mounted violin bow, unbranded. These all look quite new, just even from afar. These just look, yeah, not very exciting. Silver mounted violin bow, unbranded. Nickel mounted violin bow, branded Grimm, Berlin. Okay, let's just have a quick look at their head. Looks a little bit funny at the head, but no, seems clear on that. Silver mounted violin bow, unbranded. Okay. Quite like that head actually on that. That's fairly interesting. Quick check what the weight is on that. Yeah, 56.64 grams. That's not a bad weight there. Nickel mounted violin bow, branded KK Gradner. Okay. Right, we're on to instruments now. Viola, labelled Michael Poller. So this is, see, Bucharesti. It's a budget Romanian viola there. No bids on that, but 396 would be probably fairly good for a child or something. Kind of interesting F holes, so low tier Romanian viola there. A viola unlabelled. Okay. Yeah, don't know. It's on one hand not very exciting, but doesn't look terrible in a way. Good condition, so it could be a good opportunity though. What's the size? 393. Not too bad. Small viola, unlabelled. This looks a bit like a kind of tertis type instrument of that kind. I know that Beers were doing some kind of tertis model violas for children or something at some point, so maybe it's something along that line. Viola labelled Paolo Neruda. Let's have a look at the measurements on this. 395 is not huge. Interesting. So question is, has this been over varnished, or has it always just been this black varnish? No idea. So that's a bit of a curious one. Viola unlabelled. Let's have a look at this. Kind of difficult to know what's going on, a few repairs, but sometimes you can see it's an interesting varnish that's wearing here and the shoulder, but yeah, hard to say with a lot of this stuff. 403 though, it's a fairly good size. Viola labelled Paul North, 375 bid on this already. Yeah, I think this is actually a very nice looking instrument and in very good condition as well, so I think this will do pretty well. 410 on that. I mean, it's doing pretty well already, so probably doesn't need rocket science to work that one out, but I think that's a nice looking viola. Viola labelled indistinctly. Let's see. Once again, difficult to kind of tell what's going on there. Current bid 20. Viola labelled Bernhard Geisel. Yeah, 30 on that. Let's have a quick look. 393. Seems to be a lot of violas at measurement 393, which is a bit curious. Viola labelled George Adam Krausch. It looks like it's had a bit of a hard life. Let's see what the condition report says on that. Close crack, bottom bout, crack back of the scroll. Yeah, do wonder if this has been rejoined. It kind of looks like it. Let's have a look though. What is the size of this thing? 385. That's quite small. Viola labelled Gunther Reuter. Okay, let's just check that. 410. I don't actually know why you have to click in to get the measurements. Probably easier if the measurements were just there, but anyway. Viola labelled CA Wunderlicht. That looks pretty standard there. 400 on that. Viola unlabelled. Yep, very standard. Actually, was that a net graph? Let's just see. I think I'm going blind. 395, okay. Viola unlabelled. Quite interesting F holes on that. Again, I don't think it's anything too crazy. 383, it's fairly small. Right, we're on to violins now. Violin labelled Antonius Stradivarius. Looks just fairly generic, so we can blitz through that. Violin unlabelled. Yeah, that's just standard. Nothing interesting there. Violin labelled illegibly. Once again, nothing too crazy there. This as well, so far we're looking at a lot of generic trade stuff. Violin labelled Johannes Baptist Havelaar. This kind of looks maybe like a Hungarian instrument of some kind. Violin labelled Q46. Okay, interesting. Okay. was going to say this is just another generic instrument, but I think it is a generic instrument, but made to look a little bit more fancy than the others. Violin unlabelled. This looks in pretty good condition. I wonder if this is potentially Chinese or something. Could be wrong. Here's a generic kind of trade violin there. Maidstone, something like that. Generic, probably German violin there. This looks like a very generic trade violin. Right, violin unlabelled. Let's have a look at that. Okay. Interesting. And a violin label, John Johnson, London, 1750. Okay. Violin labelled Antonius Stradivarius, Cremonensis. This I think is quite interesting actually. Definitely needs a bit of work, but yeah, kind of curious. Back on that, it's had a bit of a break at the button. Very interesting scroll. Let's just have a look at the condition report on that. It's not terrible. What's the length of back on this? 354, that's kind of okay. Violin unlabelled. This is interesting looking thing actually. It's a fairly curious one. Looks like it's been fiddled about with varnish wise. Okay, what's the length of back of this one actually? 358. Violin labelled Andreas Amati. I think this is just a generic trade violin. Violin unlabelled. So, full disclosure, if you watch some of my videos, you might notice this. This is actually an instrument I did a video on. This is like a hop family instrument, probably circa 1800, but I've decided to move it on and clear some space. As you can see from the condition report, it's in pretty bad condition, unfortunately, but it is generally quite old, and I think it is a hop family instrument. But with these affordable auctions, it's just, unless it has a label, it just doesn't get an attribution or anything. So yeah, if you want to probably a budget older instrument, that's could be worse. Right, a violin unlabelled. Let's have a look here. Looks like it's in a bit of a funny condition. So this, I think, is one of the very budget kind of 18th century French violins, which look like these kind of Czech trade instruments, but I think that is actually an 18th century French violin. 355 length of back there. Right, a violin inscribed, repaired by F. Spacey, current bid 120. Let's see here. I think that this is, yeah, inked purfling on this. Quite interesting back. So this looks like the kind of London, like mid to late 18th century stuff, like one of the makers from the London school, with a few kind of issues going on here and there. So yeah, it's a few problems there, but interesting violin. Let's have a look what the size it is. 355, that's not too bad. Violin labelled Alexander Galliano. So disclosure again, this is another one that I think I did a video on that I'm clearing out. Actually really nice violin, really amazing scroll actually. I think it's probably some kind of 18th century, or I think I said like early 19th century Mittenwald violin of some kind, but really nice varnish on the back, but it has some issues, condition issues. So yeah, I think it's a really interesting violin and probably a good project for someone there. Needs definitely a bit of TLC. 3/4 size violin, we can skip that. Some couple of 3/4 there as well. Violin labelled Carlo Bergonzi. It's lost a bit of its F-hole. Don't think it's anything too crazy there. Violin unlabelled. This looks fairly generic. Violin unlabelled. Yeah, a lot of this stuff is pretty generic trade stuff from one country or another. Violin branded Respis Finum. The wax seal on the back. Interesting lion head on that. Violin branded Nicolas Quattro or something. This looks like a French violin of some kind, probably 18th century. That kind of varnish. Actually quite a nice looking violin. Definitely needs some work though, but yeah, interesting. I mean, that is probably believable. Like, it probably is a late 18th century French violin and needs obviously a bit of work, but quite a nice instrument that. So yeah, like that one. Violin labelled JTL. This is a standard kind of French. Actually not too bad a looking JTL there. Let's see what the length of back is. 259. Not terrible. Violin labelled Amati. I think it's another generic trade. Quite a nice back actually, so that might do well. Made in Saxony for Riley and Son in Birmingham. Violin labelled 2T40. Okay. Another generic violin. I always think of these ones as probably being made in Hungary or something, but that's probably wrong, when they're probably just somewhere German, Czech border or something. Violin unlabelled. This looks like a just generic thing. Right, violin unlabelled. So this, I think, is an 18th century violin, 1800s kind of thing. Like something German also. Let's see what the length of back is. 255. It's not too bad. Violin unlabelled. Let's see. I think this is like a Medifino, like a generic French violin, like 19th century or something like that. Looks like it's got inked purfling as well, so the French were doing ink purfling as well as the Germans in some place in the English. Right, violin labelled H. Patterson. This looks fairly kind of amateur English kind of thing. Violin labelled Skylark, so that's a Chinese instrument. Violin labelled Antonius Stradivarius Cremonensis. Yeah, kind of curious looking varnish on this one, and pretty bonkers F-holes there. That's actually quite an interesting back on that. So kind of interesting corner work and stuff. Not really quite sure what to make of that. Scroll looks pretty generic, so yeah, hard to say. What's the size of it? 359. It's fairly big. Violin labelled Agedius or Agedius Cloths. This looks like some kind of older German violin of some kind. Probably not a Klotz, but maybe it's 19th century or something like that. Violin labelled Arthur James Rope. This one has had a bit of an adventure. It's a massive varnish separation there, so that's a bit of a interesting one. Violin labelled Nicholas Bergonzi. Looks like it's had a few repairs and maybe some varnish issues going on there. Quite a nice scroll though, it's quite interesting. See what the condition report says. Some issues on that. Stentor, that's pretty standard. Very low end Roth type thing possibly. Violin labelled Wolf Brothers. Just standard German trade. Violin unlabelled. Kind of funky F-holes. Painted flames at the back. Very low end German, I presume somewhere in the mountains or the farmers or something like that. Violin unlabelled. Pretty generic. Another trade kind of thing. Let's have a look at this. Violin unlabelled. Yes, another generic type thing. Violin unlabeled. Let's have a look at this. Once again, looks like a fairly low tier instrument. That one as well, I don't think there's any point in looking at that. This one also seems to not have a back picture for some reason. That's a pretty bonkers scroll. No idea what's going on with that one. So strange. Violin labelled Joseph Guarnerius. Just looks like another trade violin. Violin labelled Arturo Barini. Just looks like a standard instrument there. Violin branded Hopf below button. Just looks generic. Violin unlabelled. Looks like a slightly mad German thing or something like that, I would expect. Violin unlabelled. Kind of interesting looking. F-holes. Interesting purfling at the back. Yeah, I think that is fairly curious. Yeah, fairly interesting instrument. What's the length of the back of that? One of the more interesting things so far. Violin unlabelled. Yeah, I'm not sure about that. That's pretty bonkers. Violin unlabelled. That looks like some very amateur work, but like fairly old amateur work. That is another bonkers thing here. Violin unlabelled. That is pretty curious. It looks like there's some pretty weird ass repairs going on that. That is some kind of mad thing for sure. Yeah, that is in a real interesting state, that one. 355 though, it's not too bad. Violin labelled Nicholas Amatus. Really heavy edge work on that. It's kind of curious. Violin unlabelled. This is fairly interesting. That's quite nice. 360 is fairly long. Violin labelled indistinctly, 1857. Let's have a look. Difficult to know on that one. That's curious. Violin, Antonius Stradivarius. I think probably a generic trade violin. This one as well. Maybe slightly higher end. Violin unlabelled. Okay. Violin labelled Emil Horth and Sonner. This thing's fairly generic. Violin unlabelled, kind of Guarneri-esque aggressive F-hole, so quite nice. Bird's eye on the back there. I'd assume that's probably Chinese, but I could be wrong. Violin unlabelled. Bit of a random mixture of things. Violin labelled Paul Bailly. Looks in a bit of a state. It looks like it's been varnish, has been messed around with. Looks like it might have been quite a nice instrument at some point. I'm sure people will bid on that. Violin labelled Sofriti Ettore. Kind of interesting varnish on that. People will bid on that as well. I'm sure 130 bid already. Violin labelled E&L Minarski. This just looks like a fairly standard trade instrument with a trade lion. Violin unlabelled. It's fairly generic. Violin labelled Richard Berger. Yes, that kind of exaggerated Hopf shape. Violin unlabelled again. Yeah, difficult to know with some of those. Violin labelled Alscher or something. I mean, it's so generic, it's really difficult. Violin unlabelled. Okay. Violin unlabelled. This is kind of interesting looking in some way. This kind of is standard 19th century trade kind of stuff, but it's fairly interesting model. Finally labelled Eugenio Degani. Just, yeah, very generic 19th century trade stuff. Violin branded Guillaume. Once again, 19th century kind of trade, I think. Violin labelled repaired by T. Thorley. This is actually quite interesting, I think, this violin. I do wonder if this might be some kind of older English thing or something. I'm not really sure, but really quite nice back. There's really interesting corner work here. Wonder what the size of it is. 355. Yeah, kind of curious one. That one. Another Strad labelled instrument here. Once again, I think it's just a trade instrument, but slightly more interesting than the others. Finally labelled C.H. Lagarde. Yeah, kind of interesting corners as well. Quite exaggerated corner work. So, kind of curious in that regard. Got to look for these little signs here and there. Violin here. Yeah, once again, I mean, probably something generic, but it has some kind of oddities to it, which make it a bit more curious. Violin unlabelled. It's just generic. Violin labelled JB Crute. Yeah, unsure of that one. Violin unlabelled. This is your standard trade, pretty nasty. Violin labelled Dulcet et Fortis, and this generic low end French. Violin unlabelled. Some kind of Eastern European thing probably. A violin labelled Hannibal Fagnola. Once again, probably something made in Eastern Europe, but you never know. Violin unlabelled. That looks like some kind of fairly generic instrument. Even though some of the varnish is kind of interesting, this can be quite confusing sometimes. Also, a lot of kind of English instruments actually of a certain period that do look a little bit like this. You look at the edge work and the corner work, it could be something more, but hard to know without seeing it in person. Violin unlabelled. Inscribed W. Tesma. I think it's just a 19th century thing again. No, that's further labelled JTL. This one, it's got a Strad label. Yeah, it's probably just generic trade. Violin labelled illegibly. Hard to know what's going on with that. Violin inscribed Mansi. I think it's another just low end French, I would think. Violin unlabelled. This I think is just another generic thing for sure. Violin unlabelled. Yeah, I think this is just more generic stuff. Let's see what's going on here. Violin labelled Frank Boddington. Boddington. This is really clearly an amateur maker, but kind of curious in a way that F-holes were a nice choice of wood actually on the back. It's quite nice. Yeah, pretty bonkers scroll, so I think probably can go with the fact that this is probably made by Frank Boddington. Pretty weird, but interesting. Half-size violin, get rid of that. Violin unlabelled, another generic type thing. Violin unlabelled, I think once again nothing too crazy. Violin labelled Joseph Guarnerius. We seem to be getting a lot of things looking pretty similar, kind of 19th, early 20th century generic stuff. 3/4 here, it's all fairly generic, so this as well I think is the same thing. So we've seen a few kind of interesting bits, but a lot of it is the same. Get rid of that. 3/4, can ignore that. Half-size violin. Violin unlabelled. Once again, I think this is another generic type thing. 3/4. That's pretty uninspiring. This once again, generic trade type thing. Fine and branded Hopf, we can skip that. Same here. That one another generic one. This is kind of a curious one. Violin labelled Joseph Guarnerius. Like weird F-hole positioning there. Pretty sure this again is just a trade violin, a generic one, but of a slightly higher level and a bit of a weirder model. But yeah, kind of interesting, I suppose. 359 length of back. Then we've got a violin labelled Wolf Brothers, another trade thing. Violin labelled Richard Duke, that I think is probably once again nothing super exciting. Kind of interesting back and varnish on that though, but otherwise don't think it's anything too crazy. Violin labelled Jeffredas Kappa, once again generic as anything. Violin labelled unlabelled. Okay, that's a slight issue there. Yeah, it's kind of a bizarre one here. Yeah, it's kind of interesting, but it's really been messed around with a fair bit. Yeah, strange, but definitely curious. Another Wolf Brothers, child size 3/4, 3/4, 3/4, all generic here. Nothing too exciting. This is interesting. Child size violin, unlabelled. It's had a bit of an accident, but I think looking at this, look at the work on this, I think this is a really, really high-end child's violin. No measurements on that, but just looking at this, I think that is a really, it's in a terrible condition, but I think that was a really nice high-level child's violin, so curious on that one. Violin labelled Laurentius Guadagnini. I think this is a fairly generic instrument. I mean, it's not too bad actually, maybe of a high level, but it's obviously falling apart a bit, so it needs some work. 1/8 cello and 1/8 violin. Okay. A tiny violin. Okay, curious. A 3/4 sized violin labelled Hidison Inzio. Okay, so just generic stuff there. 2 viola fronts. Okay, that's kind of curious. Pretty bizarre lot. Don't know why there's 2 viola fronts, but apparently there is. Curious. Some bows here. I'm not going to get too much into this. It's all fairly uninspiring, I think. So we'll probably, after these bows, there might be some books and things. Yeah, there you go. Stradivari, Violin Bridges 2. Bound volumes. Hang on, what was that? Bound volumes of various musical instrument publications. Strad, Musical Times, Musical Herald, etc. Random. 2 bound volumes of the Strad. 7 books. Okay, 6 books. La Casa Musale. 2 books. Nothing exciting. 3 books. Franz Geisenhoff book there. Violin Makers of Guarneri Family. Gasparo de Salo. Essential Guide to Bows of the Violin Family. Interesting. J.B. Vione book. History of the Violin. 3 books of instrument sales. Shape of Stradivari forms. De Goldbogen. Cesar Candy. Lutista. 70 on that. That's popular. Monograph collection. Dictionary of Bowmakers. Benjamin Banks book, which is decent. Lutria Italiana by Eric Blott. That'll probably sell quite well. 3 books about something. Violin Makers of the Low Countries, which actually would be quite interesting to look at. Italian Violin Makers, and Italian Violin Makers again. Gan Pajot Bowmakers. 400 Years of Violin Making in the Netherlands. Violin Making in Scotland, that is a good book. Venetian Instruments. Art of Violin Making, which is actually a good book for learning how to make violins. Wemberg book on US makers, that's a really decent book as well, really like that. Dictionary of Makers, Viola Brothers book, interesting one. Plowright book there, 6 books. Viola and violin case branded Jaeger, which was like a pretty good make of cases at some point. Violin case branded BAM, so I think it's one of those super light cases, really small, they're quite interesting. 2 travel bow tubes, interesting. 12 slot bow case, 24 slot bow case, 4 bow cases, cello case branded JT cases, cello case branded New Tech by BAM. And that is it. I think that's the end of the auction. That didn't go on too long in the end. Yeah, not a bad auction. Yeah, okay. I think we've seen better affordable auctions, but we've also seen worse auctions before. So somewhere in the middle, definitely a few interesting items across the board. Cellos, bows, violins, violas, other bits and pieces. Definitely some things worth looking at. So yeah, I'll put a link in the description as always. Check it out and see what you think yourself. Feel free to comment if you've got any thoughts. So thanks a lot for watching again. Really appreciate it. And I'll catch you next time. Bye.